The morning alarm rang through the metal corridors of New Seoul Station like it had for the past 200 years. Kim Tae-ho rolled off his narrow bunk and pulled on his gray work uniform. The fabric was rough against his skin, but it was better than the scratchy material they used to give maintenance workers. At least that was what the older workers told him. Tae-ho walked through the dimly lit hallways toward the atmospheric processing center. Other workers moved like ghosts around him, their heads down, their steps quiet. Speaking too loudly in the corridors could bring unwanted attention from the Imperial Guards. Everyone knew that rule by now. The processing center hummed, with the sound of massive machines cleaning and recycling the station's air. Tae-ho had worked here for 8 years. Ever since he turned 18, his job was simple. Check the filters, replace the broken parts, and keep the machines running. It was boring work, but it kept him alive. He opened his tool case and began his daily routine. Filter number 1 needed cleaning. Filter number 2 had a small crack that he could fix with metal paste. Filter number 3 was working fine. As he worked, Tae-ho let his mind wander to the small room he kept hidden behind the water recycling tanks. 3 months ago, Tae-ho had been repairing a damaged wall panel when he found something that changed his life. Behind the panel was a small space, barely big enough for a person to crawl into. Inside that space were books, real books made of paper, not the digital files that the Empire allowed them to read. The books were old and falling apart. Some pages were missing, and others were too damaged to read. But Tae-ho could still make out most of the words. They were written in Korean, the language his grandmother had taught him in secret when he was a child. The Empire had banned all human languages except basic English, but his grandmother had been stubborn. That first day, Tae-ho had spent his entire lunch break reading. The books contained things he had never seen before. There were poems about mountains and rivers, stories about brave warriors, and writings about something called philosophy. The words made him feel strange, like he was waking up from a long sleep. Since then, Tae-ho had spent every free moment in his hidden room. He had moved the books to a safer place behind the recycling tanks where no one ever went. He had even found an old lamp that still worked, so he could read when his shift ended. Today was different though. Today Tae-ho had decided to try something dangerous. He had spent weeks copying some of the shorter poems onto small pieces of metal using a cutting tool. His plan was to share them with other workers, but he had to be careful. If the Imperial Guards found out, they would not just punish him, they would execute him. As he worked on the filters, Tae-ho thought about his childhood friend, Lee. She worked in the compliance office now, checking to make sure all the workers followed Imperial rules. They rarely talked anymore, but sometimes he caught her looking at him with sad eyes. He wondered if she remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell them when they were children. The workday passed slowly. Tae-ho cleaned filters, replaced parts, and checked pressure readings. His hands did the work automatically while his mind thought about the books. There was one poem that he had read over and over. It was about a man who climbed a mountain to see the world below. The man in the poem felt free when he reached the top, like he could see everything clearly for the first time. Tae-ho had never seen a mountain. He had never seen anything except the inside of the space station, but somehow, the poem made him understand what freedom might feel like. When the workday ended, Tae-ho did not go back to his sleeping quarters like the other workers. Instead, he made his way to the lower levels where the recycling systems were located. He had to be careful not to be seen. The Imperial Guards did not patrol the lower levels often, but they had cameras everywhere. He crawled through a maintenance tunnel that led to his hidden room. The space was small and uncomfortable, but it felt more like home than his actual quarters. He turned on the old lamp and looked at his collection of books. There were 12 of them now. He had found more books and other damaged wall panels as he did his repairs around the station. Tae-ho picked up a book of poems and began to read. The words seemed to glow in the lamplight. He read about cherry blossoms in spring, about lovers meeting under the moon, about children playing in fields of grass. These were things that did not exist in his world, but the words made them feel real. As he read, Tae-ho began to understand something important. The books were not just stories or poems. They were proof that humans had once lived differently. They had once been free to think and feel and create beautiful things. The Empire had tried to erase all of that, but they had failed. The books were still here. Tae-ho spent 2 hours reading before he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He quickly turned off the lamp and listened. The footsteps were light and careful, not like the heavy boots of Imperial Guards. Someone was trying not to be heard. He crawled to the entrance of his hiding place and peered out. In the dim light of the corridor, he could see a figure in a compliance officer uniform. His heart stopped. It was Nari. She was scanning the walls with a small device, probably checking for energy readings or unauthorized equipment. Tae-ho held his breath and stayed perfectly still. If she found his hiding place, everything would be over. Nari moved slowly along the corridor, checking each section carefully. She was doing her job, following Imperial procedures. But when she reached the area where Tae-ho was hiding, something strange happened. The device in her hand began to beep softly, indicating it had found something unusual. Nari stopped and looked at the device. Then she looked at the wall where Taeho was hiding. For a long moment, she stood there without moving. Taeho could see her face in the dim light. She looked confused and maybe a little scared. Then Nari did something that surprised him. She turned off the device and walked away. She had found evidence of his secret room, but she had chosen not to investigate further. She had chosen not to report it. Tae-Ho waited until her footsteps disappeared completely before he came out of his hiding place. His hands were shaking as he gathered his books and prepared to leave. He had been discovered, but somehow he was still safe. As he made his way back to his quarters, Taeho thought about the look on Nari's face. Maybe she remembered their childhood too. Maybe she remembered his grandmother's stories. Maybe there was still hope for the friendship they had once shared, but more importantly, maybe there were other people on the station who were ready to remember what it meant to be human. Maybe it was time to find out. 3 weeks had passed since Nari had discovered his hiding place. Taeho went about his daily work routine, but everything felt different now. He watched Nari from a distance during mealtimes, trying to understand why she had not reported him. She never looked directly at him, but he caught her glancing in his direction when she thought no one was watching. The books had become more important to him than ever. Each night, he returned to his secret room and read by the light of his old lamp. The poems and stories were starting to make more sense now. He was beginning to understand the deeper meanings behind the words. The writers were not just telling stories. They were sharing feelings and ideas that the Empire had tried to destroy. One evening, as Taeho was reading a book about ancient Korean philosophy, he heard someone approaching his hiding place. His heart began to beat faster. This time, the footsteps were heavier and more confident. He quickly turned off his lamp and listened. To his surprise, he heard a familiar voice calling his name softly. It was Park Minzu, the old janitor who cleaned the upper levels of the station. Minzu was known for being quiet and keeping to himself. Most workers barely noticed him as he went about his cleaning duties. Taeho crawled out of his hiding place and found Minzu standing in the corridor with a small bag in his hands. The old man looked nervous but determined. "I know what you have been doing," Minzu said quietly. "Nari told me about the energy readings she found. She did not report you because she wanted me to talk to you first." Taeho felt confused and frightened. "I do not understand. What do you want from me?" Minzu opened his bag and pulled out 3 books. They were different from the ones Taeho had found, but they were also written in Korean. "I have been keeping these hidden for 20 years, Minzu said. "I was a university professor before the Empire took control. I taught Korean literature and history." Taeho stared at the books in amazement. "There are others like me." "More than you know," Minzu replied, "but we have been waiting for someone young and brave enough to help us. Nari thinks you might be that person." Minzu explained that he had been part of a small group of people who remembered life before the Empire. They had been meeting in secret for years, sharing memories and keeping human culture alive in small ways. But they were all getting old, and they needed younger people to carry on their work. "We have been too afraid to do anything significant," Minzu admitted, "but you have been reading and learning on your own. That shows courage we have not seen in a long time." Over the next hour, Minzu told Taeho about the other members of their group. There was Choi Hyejin, a medical technician who worked in the health center. She had been using her position to gather information about imperial policies and share it quietly with other workers. There was also Sun Woo-jin, a young engineer who repaired communication equipment. He had been experimenting with ways to send messages without being detected by imperial surveillance. "We want to invite you to meet with us," Minzu said, "but you must understand the risk. If we are discovered, we will all be executed." Taeho thought about the poems he had been reading. Many of them were about people who chose to fight for what they believed in, even when it was dangerous. He realized that this was his chance to become like the brave people in those stories. "I will meet with you," he said. 2 days later, Taeho followed Minzu's instructions and made his way to a storage room in the deepest part of the station. The room was filled with old equipment that had not been used in years. Hidden behind a large machine, he found 3 people waiting for him. Nari was there, still wearing her compliance officer uniform. She looked different than she had when they were children. Her face was more serious, and her eyes seemed older. But when she saw Taeho, she smiled the same way she used to when they were friends. Hyejin was a woman about 30 years old, with short black hair. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice, but Taeho could tell she was very intelligent. Woo-jin was closer to Taeho's age, maybe 25 or 26. He had the quick, nervous energy of someone who worked with complicated machines all day. "We have been waiting a long time to expand our group," Hyejin said, "but we had to be sure we could trust you." Nari spoke next. "I have been watching you for months, not as a compliance officer, but as someone who remembers our childhood. I could see that you were changing, becoming more thoughtful and confident. When I found evidence of your secret activities, I knew it was time." Woo-jin pulled out a small device that looked like a regular maintenance scanner. I have been modifying equipment like this to send coded messages between different parts of the station. We can communicate without the Imperial surveillance systems detecting us. Minsu opened one of his books and showed everyone a page filled with Korean writing. We have been collecting and preserving human culture in small ways. But now, we want to do more. We want to start teaching other people. The group spent the next 2 hours sharing their knowledge and making plans. Haijin had been using her medical position to learn about Imperial record-keeping systems. She had discovered that many official historical documents had been altered or destroyed. The Empire's version of human history was full of lies. According to Imperial records, humans were a primitive species that welcomed being conquered, she explained. But I have found evidence that this is not true. Humans were actually very advanced before the Empire arrived. We chose to surrender only to prevent total destruction of our species. This information shocked Taeho. He had always believed that humans were naturally inferior to other species in the galaxy. That was what Imperial education had taught him. Wu had been experimenting with the station's communication systems. He had found ways to access restricted networks and databases. I have discovered that there are human settlements on dozens of other worlds, he said. All of them are living under the same restrictions we face here. Minsu had the most surprising information of all. I have been in contact with similar groups on 3 other space stations. We use old maintenance codes to send messages through the Imperial Communication Network. They do not suspect that anyone would use such an outdated system. As the meeting continued, Taeho felt more excited than he had ever been in his life. He was not alone in his desire to learn and preserve human culture. There were others who shared his dreams of freedom and knowledge. But the meeting also made him realize how dangerous their situation was. The Empire had spent 2 centuries trying to erase human identity. If they discovered this small group of people working to preserve it, the punishment would be severe. What happens next? Taeho asked. Na-R. I looked at each member of the group before answering. We start teaching others, carefully and slowly, but we start sharing what we know. It is time for more humans to remember who they really are. As the group prepared to leave their secret meeting place, Minsu handed Taeho 2 more books. Study these, he said. Next week, we will begin planning our first lesson for other workers. You will help us decide what to teach them first. Taeho returned to his quarters that night feeling like his life had completely changed. He was no longer just a maintenance worker who read books in secret. He was part of something bigger, and, more important, he was part of a movement to save human culture from being forgotten forever. The first secret lesson took place in the old storage room where the group had met before. Taeho and his friends had carefully chosen 5 workers to invite. They were people who seemed curious about the world and asked questions that others were afraid to ask. Minsu began the lesson by teaching them basic Korean characters. He showed them how to write simple words like freedom, hope, and truth. The new students were nervous at first, but their eyes grew bright with excitement as they learned to read words in their own language. Taeho shared some of the shorter poems he had memorized. When he recited a poem about the beauty of autumn leaves, one of the students began to cry. She said she had forgotten that humans used to write about beautiful things instead of just following work schedules and imperial orders. After 3 weeks of secret lessons, Woojin came to the group with an exciting discovery. He had been studying the station's communication systems more carefully and found something amazing. The maintenance channels that carried messages between different work areas could be modified to reach much farther than anyone realized. I think I can make our voices travel to other space stations, he told the group during one of their meetings. The Imperial Guards never monitor the maintenance frequencies because they think they are only used for boring repair work. Haijin had been making her own discoveries in the medical center. While organizing old files, she had found technical documents that proved something shocking. Many of the Empire's most important technologies were actually based on human inventions. From before the conquest, look at this, she said, showing the group a file she had secretly copied. The atmospheric processing systems, the quantum communication networks, even the power generators on Imperial ships. They all use principles that humans discovered first. The documents showed that human scientists had been far more advanced than the Empire had ever admitted. In fact, humans had been leaders in technology and innovation across the galaxy. The Empire had not conquered a primitive species. They had conquered the most creative and intelligent species they had ever encountered. This is why they fear us so much, Minsu said quietly. They know that if humans ever remember what we are capable of, we will surpass them again. This discovery gave Taeho an idea that would change everything. What if we could share this information with humans on other stations? He asked. What if we could use Woojin's communication system to tell them the truth about our history? The group discussed the idea for hours. It was extremely dangerous, but it could also be the most important thing they ever did. If they could reach other human settlements and tell them the truth about their past, it might inspire others to start their own resistance groups. Woojin spent the next 2 weeks modifying a maintenance transmitter. He disguised his work as routine equipment repairs, so the Imperial Guards would not suspect anything. When he finished, he had created a device that could send voice messages across multiple star systems using maintenance frequencies. The first broadcast was planned for a quiet night when most of the Imperial guards would be sleeping. Taeho had spent days preparing what he would say. He wanted to share not just information, but also hope and inspiration. On the night of the broadcast, the entire group gathered in Woojin's workshop. The modified transmitter sat on his workbench, looking like an ordinary piece of maintenance equipment, but Taeho knew it was about to become the most important tool in their fight for freedom. Remember, Woojin whispered, keep your voice low and speak clearly. We do not know how many people might be listening. Taeho sat down in front of the transmitter and took a deep breath. When Woojin gave him the signal, he began to speak. My name is Taeho, and I am speaking to you from New Seoul Station. I am a human being, and I have something important to tell you. We have been lied to. About our history, we have been told that humans were primitive and weak before the Empire conquered us. This is not true. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued. I have found books written by our ancestors. They show us that humans were once free, and creative, and strong. We built amazing things. We wrote beautiful poetry. We asked difficult questions and found brilliant answers. The Empire took all of this away from us because they were afraid of what we could become. Taeho spent the next 10 minutes sharing some of the poems he had memorized and explaining what they meant. He talked about the beauty of human language and the power of human ideas. He told his listeners that they were not alone in their desire for something better. There are others like you who remember that life can be more than just work and obedience. He said, find them, learn from them, share what you know. Together, we can remember who we really are. The broadcast ended, and the group sat in silence for several minutes. They had no way of knowing if anyone had heard their message, but they all felt that something important had just happened. Over the next few days, strange things began to occur around the station. Workers seemed more alert and curious. Some people were caught whispering to each other in corners where they thought no one could see them. A few maintenance workers were found reading instruction manuals more carefully than usual, as if they were looking for hidden meanings in the words. Most surprisingly, Nari reported that the compliance office had received several requests from workers, asking about historical records and cultural documents. The Imperial supervisors were confused by these requests because humans had never shown interest in such things before. 2 weeks after the first broadcast, Taeho decided to try again. This time, he shared a story about Korean warriors who had fought bravely to protect their homeland. He explained that courage and honor were important human values that should not be forgotten. After the second broadcast, Woojin made another exciting discovery. His communication device had been receiving signals from other star systems. Someone was trying to respond to their messages. The first response came from a woman who said she was broadcasting from a mining colony called New Busan. She thanked Taeho for his words and said that his broadcasts had inspired her to start teaching other workers about their cultural heritage. More responses followed. A man from a farming settlement said he had found old Korean songs and was teaching them to his children. A group of factory workers reported that they had formed a secret study group to discuss the ideas that Taeho had shared. Within a month, Taeho was receiving messages from 12 different human settlements across the galaxy. Each group was small, but they were all doing the same thing. They were remembering and preserving human culture. The broadcasts had become a regular event. Every few days, Taeho would sit in front of the transmitter and share poems, stories, or ideas with his growing audience. He began to think of himself not just as a maintenance worker, but as a teacher and a voice for human freedom. But success brought new dangers. The Imperial authorities were starting to notice unusual patterns in worker behavior across multiple star systems. Human productivity was declining slightly as people spent more time thinking about things other than their work assignments. During one of their group meetings, Nari brought disturbing news from the compliance office. They are planning to conduct a full investigation of all communication systems on the station, she said. They know something is happening, but they do not know what yet. The group realized that their time was running out. Soon, the Imperial guards would discover their secret broadcasts and their hidden books. They needed to make a decision about what to do next. We could stop the broadcasts and go back to meeting in secret, Minsu suggested. It would be safer, but Taeho shook his head. We have already started something that cannot be stopped. People across the galaxy are waking up. If we stop now, we will be abandoning them. Hyjin agreed. The Empire is already suspicious. Stopping now will not make us safe. We might as well continue and try to accomplish as much as possible before they catch us. As the meeting ended, Taeho realized that his quiet life as a maintenance worker was over forever. He had become something he never expected to be. He had become a revolutionary, and there was no going back. The investigation began on a Tuesday morning. Imperial guards swept through the station in organized groups, checking every room and scanning every piece of equipment. Taeho watched from his work area as they moved through the corridors, like hunting animals looking for prey. Nari had warned them the night before. She had risked everything to steal information from the compliance office about the planned search. The group had worked frantically to hide their books and equipment, but they all knew it was probably too late. They have detected unusual energy patterns in the maintenance systems, Nari had explained during their emergency meeting. They know someone has been modifying communication equipment, but they do not know who or where. Wu Jin had dismantled his broadcasting device and hidden the pieces in different locations around the station. The books were moved to new hiding places that would be harder to find. But everyone knew that if the Imperial Guards searched long enough and hard enough, they would eventually discover everything. The investigation continued for 3 days. Workers were questioned about their activities and their loyalty to the Empire. Several people were taken away for more detailed questioning, but none of them were members of Teiho's group. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Teiho was repairing a ventilation system when he heard 2 Imperial Guards talking in the corridor outside. The investigation is being called off. One of them said, "Orders from High Command. They want all personnel to report to the main conference room immediately." Teiho finished his repair work and carefully made his way to a position where he could observe the main conference room without being seen. Through a small window, he watched as Captain Vexera, the station's security chief, addressed a gathering of Imperial officers. "We have received reports from 17 different star systems," the captain announced. "Human workers in all of these locations are showing signs of unusual behavior. They are asking questions about history and culture. Some have been caught trying to learn human languages." Teiho felt his heart beating faster. The broadcasts had reached even more people than they had realized. "High Command believes this is part of a coordinated rebellion," the captain continued. "They want us to focus our efforts on finding the source of these transmissions. Local investigations are being suspended so we can concentrate on the bigger threat." After the meeting ended, Teiho hurried back to tell his group what he had learned. They gathered in their usual meeting place, but this time their mood was different. Instead of fear, they felt excitement and hope. 17 star systems, Minsu repeated in amazement. "We have inspired people across 17 different worlds." Hyjin had been using her medical access to monitor Imperial communications. She had discovered that the situation was even bigger than Captain Vexera had revealed. "I have been reading their internal reports," she said. "The unusual behavior is not limited to human settlements. Some alien species are also beginning to ask questions about the Empire's treatment of different cultures." This was the most surprising news yet. The group had focused on awakening human consciousness, but their message was apparently reaching other species as well. Wu Jin had been working on a new version of his broadcasting equipment. "I have been thinking about what we learned," he said. "If the Empire is worried about transmissions from multiple star systems, that means other people are broadcasting too. We are not the only ones anymore." Over the next few weeks, the group's suspicions were confirmed. Wu Jin's new equipment began receiving regular transmissions from human settlements across the galaxy. A teacher named Yoon Sang-mi was broadcasting from a colony called Nudagu, sharing lessons about Korean history and culture. A former soldier named Jang Hyunwoo was organizing physical training sessions that taught traditional Korean martial arts. Most importantly, a communications expert named Seo Yoonji had figured out how to improve the broadcast network. Her modifications allowed messages to travel farther and clearer than ever before. Soon, humans on more than 30 worlds were able to communicate with each other regularly. Taiho's role in the growing movement was changing. Instead of just sharing poems and stories, he was now coordinating activities between different resistance groups. He helped plan simultaneous broadcasts where multiple people would share the same message at the same time. He organized cultural exchange programs where groups from different worlds would teach each other about their local traditions and discoveries. The most important discovery came from a group of researchers on a world called Nuj. They had managed to access old Imperial archives and found documents that revealed the true history of the Empire's expansion across the galaxy. "The Empire has been doing this for centuries," the lead researcher explained during a broadcast. "They conquer species that show signs of advanced culture or technology. Then they erase the conquered species' history and identity to prevent them from challenging Imperial authority." The documents showed that humans were not the only victims. The Empire had systematically destroyed the cultures of dozens of different species over the past 500 years. Each conquest followed the same pattern: military defeat, cultural suppression, and historical revision. "We are not fighting just for human freedom," Teiho realized during one of his broadcasts. "We are fighting for the freedom of every species that has been oppressed by the Empire." This revelation changed the entire nature of their movement. Instead of just trying to preserve human culture, they were now working to expose the Empire's crimes against all intelligent species. The response was immediate and powerful. Alien species that had been quietly unhappy with Imperial rule began reaching out to the human resistance groups. They shared their own suppressed histories and cultural traditions. They offered to help in the fight against the Empire. One of the most significant contacts came from Admiral Kothmarin, a high-ranking Imperial officer from a species called the Zent. The Zentari had been conquered by the Empire 300 years earlier, and Admiral Kothmarin had spent his entire career serving the system that had destroyed his people's culture. "Your broadcasts have reminded me of songs my grandmother used to sing," he said in a secret message to Teho. "I had forgotten that my people once had art and literature and philosophy. The Empire made us forget who we were, just like they did to you." Admiral Kothmarin began secretly sharing Imperial military information with the resistance groups. He revealed that the Empire's forces were not as strong as they appeared. Many Imperial officers were from conquered species who had been forced to serve the Empire. If given the chance, many of them would choose to fight for freedom instead. The information from Admiral Kothmarin allowed the resistance groups to plan more effective operations. They began targeting Imperial communication centers and data storage facilities. They rescued, suppressed historical documents, and cultural artifacts from dozens of different species. But the Empire was not sitting still. Imperial forces began conducting massive raids on suspected resistance settlements. Entire communities were relocated to high-security facilities. The punishment for possessing forbidden cultural materials was changed from imprisonment to immediate execution. The pressure was building toward a final confrontation. Teho and his allies knew that they could not continue their activities much longer without being caught, but they also knew that their movement had grown too large to be stopped by Imperial force alone. During one of their group meetings, Nari brought the most serious news yet. "The Empire is planning something called Operation Cultural Cleansing," she announced. "They are going to destroy all remaining evidence of pre-conquest cultures across the galaxy. Every book, every song, every piece of art that survived there. Previous efforts will be eliminated." The group realized that this was their final chance. If they did not act soon, everything they had worked to preserve would be lost forever. "We need to do something big," Teho said. "Something that will wake up every person in the galaxy and show them what the Empire really is." Minsu nodded gravely. "It is time for the final broadcast. We will tell the entire galaxy the truth about the Empire's crimes. We will call for a general uprising of all oppressed species." As they began planning for what might be their last act of resistance, Teho thought about the books that had started his journey. The poems and stories had taught him about courage and sacrifice. Now he was about to discover what those words really meant. The final broadcast was scheduled for the night when 3 Imperial transport ships would arrive at New Sol Station. Nari had learned that the ships carried equipment for Operation Cultural Cleansing. Once they docked, the Empire would begin the systematic destruction of every piece of cultural evidence they could find. Teho and his group had spent 2 weeks preparing for this moment. Wujin had rebuilt his broadcasting equipment one last time, making it more powerful than ever before. The signal would reach every corner of the galaxy simultaneously. There would be no way for the Empire to stop or block the transmission. SEOUNG had coordinated with resistance groups on 47 different worlds. They would all broadcast at the same time, sharing evidence of the Empire's crimes and calling for immediate action. The combined signal would be so strong that every communication device in Imperial space would receive it, whether the Empire wanted them to or not. But the plan was extremely dangerous. The modified broadcasting equipment would create such a strong energy signature that Imperial forces would be able to locate it within minutes. Everyone involved in the broadcast would certainly be captured or killed. "We all understand what this means," Minsu said during their final meeting. "This is not just a broadcast. This is our last stand." Haijin had prepared a special contribution to the broadcast. She had compiled all the evidence they had gathered about the Empire's use of stolen technology and suppressed innovations. "People need to know that the Empire built their entire civilization on the backs of the species they conquered," she said. Natri had made the most difficult decision of all. She had chosen to abandon her position in the compliance office and openly join the resistance. "I cannot pretend to serve the Empire while my friends are risking their lives for freedom," she explained. On the night of the broadcast, the group gathered in Wujin's workshop for the last time. Through the station's windows, they could see the 3 Imperial transport ships docking at the main port. Soon, Imperial forces would begin searching for any remaining traces of human culture. Wujin activated his equipment and checked the connections to the station's main communication array. Everything was working perfectly. Across the galaxy, dozens of other resistance groups were making their final preparations. "This is it," Teho said, sitting down in front of the transmitter. "Whatever happens next, we have already accomplished something important. We have reminded people across the galaxy that they are more than just workers and subjects. We have shown them that they have the right to remember who they are." At exactly midnight station time, Teho began the broadcast that would change the galaxy forever. "My name is Kim Teho, and I am speaking to you from New Sol Station. Tonight, I want to tell you the truth about the Galactic Dominion Empire. They are not the protectors and civilizers they claim to be. They are thieves. and destroyers who have spent centuries stealing the cultures and innovations of other species. As Taeho spoke, similar broadcasts began on worlds across the galaxy. Yoon Sang-mi shared evidence of imperial lies about human history. Jang Hyanwu revealed documents showing how the Empire had used conquered species as forced labor. Youngji broadcasted technical specifications proving that Imperial technology was stolen from their victims. The Empire fears us because they know we are capable of greatness. Taeho continued. They have spent centuries trying to make us forget our strength and creativity. But we remember. We remember the beauty of our languages, the wisdom of our philosophies, and the power of our innovations. The broadcast continued for 20 minutes, with different speakers from different worlds sharing their evidence and their stories. The signal was so strong that it overwhelmed Imperial communication systems across multiple star systems. Every person in the galaxy heard the message, whether they wanted to or not. As the broadcast neared its end, Taeho could hear Imperial forces moving through the corridors of the station. They had located the source of the transmission and were coming to stop it. The time for hiding is over, Taeho said into the transmitter. The time for revolution has begun. Rise up, all oppressed species. Reclaim your cultures, your histories, and your freedom. The Empire cannot stop all of us if we act together. The workshop door exploded inward as Imperial guards stormed into the room. But it was too late. The broadcast had ended, and the message had been delivered to every corner of the galaxy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. On world after world, oppressed species began rising up against Imperial authority. Human settlements declared independence from Imperial rule. Alien species that had been forced to serve the Empire began rebelling against their oppressors. Admiral Ko kept his promise to help the resistance. He led a group of Imperial officers from conquered species in a mutiny against the Empire's high command. They seized control of several Imperial warships and used them to protect rebelling worlds from Imperial retaliation. Within hours of the broadcast, the Empire was fighting rebellions on hundreds of worlds simultaneously. Their forces were spread too thin to suppress all the uprisings. More importantly, many Imperial soldiers from conquered species began defecting to join the rebels. The final blow came when resistance groups on the Imperial capital world discovered and released the complete archives of the Empire's cultural suppression programs. The documents showed exactly how the Empire had systematically destroyed the identities of every species they had conquered. The revelation that the Empire had been built on lies and theft turned even some of the Empire's original supporters against them. Species that had willingly joined the Empire centuries earlier realized that they had been helping to oppress others, just like themselves. Taeho and his friends were captured during the raid on their workshop, but they were not executed. As expected, the Empire was collapsing too quickly for them to waste time on individual prisoners. Instead, they were held in a detention center on New Sol Station while Imperial forces tried desperately to maintain control. 3 weeks after the broadcast, Admiral Kothmiran's rebel fleet arrived at New Sol Station. The Imperial forces surrendered without a fight, and Taeho's group was freed, along with hundreds of other political prisoners. The Galactic Dominion Empire officially collapsed 6 months later when the last Imperial strongholds fell to rebel forces. The Emperor and his closest advisors fled to unknown parts of the galaxy, leaving behind a power vacuum that had to be filled by the liberated species. Representatives from dozens of worlds met to form a new galactic government based on cultural preservation and species equality. The new Federation of Free Worlds had one primary law: no species would ever again be forced to abandon their culture or identity. Taeho was invited to serve as the Federation's first Director of Cultural Preservation, but he declined the offer. He had never wanted to be a politician or a leader. He had only wanted to read books and share stories. Instead, he returned to his simple life, but with a new purpose. He became a teacher, traveling from world to world to help liberated species recover their lost cultures and languages. He taught humans to read Korean poetry, helped alien species translate their ancient texts, and encouraged everyone to remember and celebrate their unique heritage. Years later, when historians wrote about the fall of the Empire, they would call it the Cultural Revolution. They would say that it began when a maintenance worker found some old books and decided to share them with his friends. But Taeho knew the truth was simpler than that. The revolution had not started with him. It had started centuries earlier. When the first person refused to let their culture die, it had continued through every parent who secretly taught their children forbidden songs, every scholar who hid dangerous books, and every person who dared to remember that they were more than just subjects of the Empire. The books had been illegal. His voice had been revolutionary. But the real power had always belonged to the people who chose to listen, to learn, and to remember who they really were. On the day that Earth was finally open to human pilgrimage, Taeho stood on the surface of humanity's birthworld and recited the first poem he had ever read in his hidden room. The words seemed to echo across the mountains and valleys, carrying the voices of all the people who had fought to keep human culture alive. The Empire had fallen, but the stories would live forever. 5 years had passed since the fall of the Galactic Dominion Empire. Taeho stood in front of a classroom filled with students from 12 different species, all eager to learn about the cultures that had almost been lost forever. The classroom was located on New Haven, a world that had been transformed into the galaxy's first multicultural education center. The students ranged in age from 8 to 80. There were young humans who had never heard Korean spoken before the revolution, elderly Zentari who remembered fragments of songs from their childhood, and middle-aged Corvani who were trying to piece together their ancestors' mathematical traditions. Today, we will learn about the power of written language, Taeho said, holding up a book that looked very much like the ones he had found in his maintenance tunnels years ago. Before the Empire, every species had their own way of recording thoughts and stories. These writing systems were not just tools for communication, they were expressions of how different species understood the world. A young human girl named Kim Sora raised her hand. She had been born during the revolution and had grown up learning both basic English and Korean. Teacher Taeho, my grandmother says you were the person who started the revolution. Is that true? Taeho smiled and shook his head. The revolution was not started by any one person. It was started by everyone who chose to remember instead of forget. I just happened to be one of the first people to speak loudly enough for others to hear. An elderly Zentari named Kothvian leaned forward in his seat. He was Admiral Kothmaron's father, and he had spent the last 5 years working with scholars to reconstruct Zentari literature. But your broadcasts gave us the courage to act. Without your voice, many of us would have continued to hide our memories. Taeho walked over to the classroom's large window and gestured for his students to join him. Outside, they could see the bustling streets of New Haven's capital city. Humans walked alongside Zentari, Corvani, and dozens of other species. Street vendors sold traditional foods from different worlds. Artists displayed paintings and sculptures that reflected the unique styles of their cultures. Look at what we have built together, Taeho said. This is what the Empire was afraid of. They knew that when different species work together while keeping their own identities, they create something more beautiful and powerful than any single culture could achieve alone. The view from the window showed the remarkable transformation that had taken place across the galaxy. The rigid, gray uniformity of imperial cities had been replaced by colorful communities where each species contributed their own traditions and innovations to the common good. In the distance, they could see the Galaxy Memorial, a massive structure that preserved artifacts and documents from all the cultures that had been suppressed by the Empire. The memorial was not just a museum, it was an active research center where scholars worked to reconstruct lost languages, art forms, and scientific knowledge. Teacher Taeho asked a young Corvani student named Veltera, what happened to the people who worked for the Empire? Were they all punished for what they did? This was a question that Taeho was asked often, and it was never easy to answer. The fall of the Empire had created complicated situations for millions of people who had served the imperial system. Many people who worked for the Empire were victims too, Taeho explained. They were forced to choose between serving the system or watching their families suffer. When the Empire fell, we had to decide whether we wanted to focus on punishment or on healing. The new Federation of Free Worlds had chosen healing over revenge. Instead of executing former imperial officials, they had created rehabilitation programs where people could learn about the cultures they had helped to suppress. Many former imperial officers had become some of the most dedicated workers in cultural preservation projects. Admiral Kothmiran had become the Federation's first defense coordinator, but he spent most of his time working to prevent conflicts. Rather than fighting them, Nuri had joined the Federation's Cultural Justice Department, where she helped other species establish truth and reconciliation programs. Minsu had returned to his calling as a professor, but now he taught at the Galaxy University, where students from hundreds of worlds learned from each other. Haijin had become the head of the Federation's Medical Archive Project, working to recover traditional healing knowledge from different species. Woojin had founded the Free Communication Network, which ensured that all species could share information without fear of censorship. The most important thing we learned, Taeho continued, is that preserving culture is not about living in the past. It is about understanding who we are so we can build a better future. The afternoon lesson focused on translation and cultural exchange. Taeho had his students work in mixed groups to translate poems and stories between different languages. The exercise was challenging because many concepts did not exist in all cultures, but that was exactly the point. When you struggle to translate something, you learn something new about both cultures, Taeho explained. The Zentari concept of Kothvalu cannot be translated directly into Korean, but trying to understand it teaches us about how the Zentari think about time and memory. As the students worked on their translations, Taeho reflected on how much his own understanding had grown over the years. Teaching students from different species had taught him that humans were remarkable, not because they were superior to other species, but because they had a unique gift for bringing different groups together, while respecting their differences. The lesson was interrupted by an announcement over the school's communication system. All students and teachers, Please gather in the main auditorium for a special presentation. Taeho led his class to the auditorium, where they found hundreds of other students and teachers waiting. On the stage stood Seo Yoon-ji, who now served as the Federation's Director of Interspecies Communication. I have exciting news to share with everyone, she announced. Our exploration teams have made contact with a new species in the outer rim of the galaxy. They call themselves the Naltheta, and they have been living in isolation for thousands of years because they were afraid of being conquered by the Empire. The auditorium erupted in excited chatter. Discovering new species was always exciting, but finding one that had successfully hidden from the Empire was especially significant. The Naltheta have agreed to meet with our cultural ambassadors, Seo Yoon-ji continued. They want to learn about the Federation and share their own knowledge with us. We are looking for volunteers to serve on the first contact team. Taeho felt a familiar excitement stirring in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced when he first found the hidden books in his maintenance tunnel. There were new stories to discover, new cultures to learn about, and new friendships to build. After the announcement, Taeho returned to his classroom to finish the day's lesson. His students were buzzing with excitement about the possibility of meeting the Naltheta and learning about their culture. Teacher Taeho asked Sora, will you volunteer to be on the first contact team? Taeho considered the question carefully. Part of him was tempted by the adventure, but he had learned that his real calling was in the classroom, helping young people understand the importance of cultural preservation and exchange. I think my place is here, he said finally, but perhaps some of you will grow up to be cultural ambassadors yourselves. The galaxy will always need people who can build bridges between different species and cultures. As the school day ended and his students headed home, Taeho remained in his classroom. To prepare for the next day's lessons, he opened one of his old Korean poetry books and read a poem about spring flowers blooming after a long winter. The poem reminded him of everything that had happened since he first discovered the hidden books. The Empire had tried to create an eternal winter for oppressed cultures, but the spring had finally come. Across the galaxy, the flowers of different traditions were blooming again, more beautiful than ever because they grew together in the same garden. Through his classroom window, Taeho could see the first stars appearing in the evening sky. Somewhere, among those stars were the Naltheta, waiting to share their stories with the galaxy. Somewhere else were former imperial strongholds that were being transformed into centers of learning and cultural exchange, and on countless worlds. In countless classrooms, teachers like himself were helping new generations understand that diversity was not a threat to be eliminated, but a treasure to be celebrated and preserved. Taeho closed his book and turned off the classroom lights. Tomorrow would bring new students, new stories, and new opportunities to build understanding between different species. The revolution that had begun with hidden books and secret broadcasts was now a daily act of teaching, learning, and growing. Together, the Empire had fallen, but the real victory was not in their defeat. The real victory was in the classrooms, the cultural centers, the translation projects, and the countless small acts of sharing and understanding that happened every day across the galaxy. As he walked home through the diverse streets of New Haven, Taeho smiled to himself. His books were no longer illegal. His voice was no longer revolutionary. But the work of building a galaxy where every species could flourish while maintaining their unique identity would continue for generations to come. And that, he thought, was the most beautiful story of all.